Wish TV. All Indiana Politics
is your premier source for Indiana politics.
Focusing on issues that matter to you.
In-depth, nonpartisan coverage, exclusive interviews with Indiana's political leaders, expert analysis on critical legislation. From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network.
Don't let high golf rates drive you out of bounds. Save big with the Wish TV Great Golf Club Card.
Central Indiana's largest golf club card membership is back for the 8th season with more courses than ever before. Save over 75% on tee times at 27 Central Indiana golf courses. All you need is the Wish TV Great Golf Club Card. Cards are valid for the entire 2026 golf season.
Great courses, great savings. Score your Great Golf Club Card today.
Central Indiana. Wish TV is now live on YouTube TV and Hulu Live, offering more hours of local programming than any other station. Search for Wish TV or look for CW8 on both YouTube TV and Hulu Live to find us. Watch local news, sports, and lifestyle shows live from Wish TV. You can still catch Wish TV free over the air or stream it live on wishtv.com and on the free Wish TV mobile apps. Wish TV, available in more places for the latest news, weather, and sports.
And welcome back to another episode of All Indiana Politics Conversations. I'm Garrett Bergquist, the producer of All Indiana Politics, and joining us once again, State Representative Ed DeLaney. Representative, welcome back to part 2 of our series.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it.
When we left off, we had talked about what got you interested in law. We talked about your service in the Navy. We talked about your work for investigative reporters and editors. So now we've reached the mid-90s here, and you had kind of an interesting role in the Dayton Peace Accords, some arbitration that came out of that. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was an interesting event. Again, it's due to politics. I had become a very good friend and supporter of a congressman named Frank McCluskey, who was from Bloomington, who was on the Armed Services Committee and had been very concerned about the war in Bosnia, the Balkan War, and was very committed to the people of Bosnia, specifically to the Croats and the Bosniaks, which really means to the Catholics and the Muslims who were being basically pummeled by the Serbian neighbor, Yugoslavia, under Milosevic. And he had taken a very active role. He got beat in the 94 election, and I helped him get hired on at my law firm. So we found out, let's be honest, we're trying to get clients for Frank. Business development. And we found out that the peace accords were being negotiated at Dayton, which was 2 hours away, and Frank knew all the people involved. So I said, call them up. We'll go visit them. So we went over there on a business development trip and got to meet, the Bosnian ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to Bosnia, the EU representative, all kinds of people. But we had a dinner, and we very arrogantly said, if you make peace, and it was hanging by a thread, the Dayton Hawks were, if you make peace, we'll come over and see if there's anything we can do to help you reconstruct. So peace was made. The law firm gave us a modest support. We went over and got hired to handle an arbitration under the Accords. On the last night in Dayton, when they finally reached the agreement, they had packed their bags to go home without an agreement because of a dispute about one area, critically, militarily, politically, every other way, critical little area of about 70,000 people with the unusual name of Brcko, and they couldn't make a deal. And at something like 2 in the morning, Milosevic, the monster, took out a piece of paper and wrote down, I will agree to arbitrate the fate of that particular community of 70,000 people, and if you'll agree to that, I'll sign the accords. We got hired to handle the arbitration. That was not our goal when we went there, but we got hired for that. So I spent 3 years leading the arbitration on behalf of the coalition of Croats and Bosniaks, which means Catholics and Muslims, as against the Serbian side. So that went on for 3 years in Rome, Vienna. It was quite the interesting thing. It was conducted in 2 languages, and the hearings were secret. And we got a very good result, which was basically to turn that area into a neutral portion of the country. It became one of the most prosperous areas in the country because people could actually come there and trade and do business without being characterized as being into one ethnic group or the other. And yeah, it was a great moment, a great opportunity. And my language skills helped because everybody thinks if you speak one Slavic language, you speak them all. You don't, but I picked up the Serbo-Croatian pretty rapidly, at least for comprehension. So that was a great adventure, and we had a brilliant judge, an American, who acted as the chief arbitrator, and he rendered a decision that I think has played out well. It hasn't solved all the problems in Bosnia. The constitution that we gave them in Dayton is very weak. But anyway, it was an adventure for me and for McCluskey, of course, and his contacts were stunning. I compared his reception there to that of what General Lafayette must have had in the United States after the birth of our country when this French guy had come. I would walk down the street with McCluskey, and people would just come up and hug him and say he saved their country. So I had a great ally in those hearings.
Tell me a little bit more about that process. So Brcko, that was the name of the town?
Yeah.
So essentially, did we have two different countries arguing over who should control this city of about 70,000 people?
It's a little more complicated. Bosnia is itself a country, but it has three ethnic groups. The largest ethnic group is the Muslim population called Bosniaks. I think the second largest is the Serbian population, and the third is the Croatian population. The geography is fascinating. Both the Serbs and the Croats have a neighboring homeland, if you want to call it. So the Croatians are just across the street from the country of Croatia. The Serbs in there are just across the street from Serbia. The Bosniaks, the Muslims, are not across the street from anybody. They're all alone. So the tension was, could the Muslims coalesce with anybody? It turned out to be the Croats, a very difficult marriage, let's call it. Very difficult marriage, but they were, and the common goal was to get Serbia to go back to Serbia and not gain any territory. And I think we've got that done. There's still tension about that. And the Serbian part of the country is doing very poorly in my observation because they don't want to be in the country. They want to be in Serbia. This is not a good strategy. Kind of reminds me of what's going on the eastern side of Ukraine. So anyway, it was an international hearing. There were people from other countries involved. I had a military escort. He was a colonel in the German army. He was our military escort for us. We got to work with the U.S. military a great deal. And it took time for peace to really get rooted in the country. That's one reason the negotiations and the arbitration lasted so long, was that the U.S. Army was not going to allow a decision to be made that was dramatic and would cause a reopening of the conflict. So I think there was a lot of thought behind the pace at which the arbitrator decided the case.
What were some things that really stood out to you during those 3 years of negotiations over Brcko?
Well, I mean, the human damage was overwhelming. The physical damage, the emotional damage. I made a lot of friends there. I couldn't get one of them to tell me the experiences their children had during the siege of Sarajevo. They wouldn't talk about it. It was so horrible, so deep in their mind. So I didn't learn about that. All through the city, there were trenches where there had been battle lines. Buildings were torn down. I lived on the top of a hill, and the presidential palace was at the bottom. It was maybe a mile down a hill, a San Francisco-style hill. I mean, really steep hills. And I would walk down to work, and I'd start getting, frankly, depressed because all these buildings around me were empty or bombed out. The streets were all torn up because people had installed gas lines. The only energy source they had were gas. All the trees were gone all over the city, stumps everywhere because people had burned the trees during the war. So that was my strongest impression, was how terrible it was. And whenever I saw something bad and thought that was as low as it could get, something else would come up. It made me feel even more upset.
Have you been back to Brcko since those arbitrations concluded?
I've been back there a number of times, and I'm proud to say my granddaughter got a Fulbright fellowship to spend a year there, so I made several extra trips when she was there. So my family has kept some connection with it, and she speaks more Bosnian than I do. We call it Bosnian now, but it's Serbo-Croatian. So yeah, I've kept the connections, although time has passed. That's 30 years ago now.
Yeah, how's Brcko doing now?
The last time I was there, it was doing quite well. I had really flowered, and it came back a little bit. But I'll never forget, I went and spent a night in the downtown. It must have been 8 or 10 years ago. And there was open-air seating and music being played, and the restaurants were stuffed. And I said, I can't believe where I am, because the first time I went there, it was mostly ruin. And you couldn't go in there if you were a Muslim or a Croat. You couldn't go in the town unless you had the U.S. Army with you. Yeah. I had a formal visit of the city. I insisted upon it as the lawyer, and we had attack helicopters protecting us, and on every other corner there was either a tank or an armored personnel carrier so that we could, quote, see the town. Let me tell you, you can't really see a town that way. All you do is look around and say, look at all this force and all this might. But that part of the country has done better, and Sarajevo has come back. I'd say half speed, but progress has been seen. Yeah, it's a very strong part of my life, very important to me emotionally, as it were. And I'm glad I did it. It was definitely worth doing.
Yeah. How did it make you feel that last time you were in Brcko, seeing how far that city and the surrounding area had come just since you had started working there?
Well, I was stunned. A bit of a story. The first night I was ever in northern Bosnia, we had been driving across these roads with crazy drivers, bridges out, and checkpoints all over. I don't like checkpoints. And finally, we got stopped by a checkpoint where the checkpoint was being conducted by a female U.S. soldier armed to the gills. She stopped us. And I said, I've never been so happy to be stopped by anybody. That was called the corner. The road was named Arizona. The U.S. Army names streets in other people's countries after American places. We don't care what they call them. So it was called the Arizona Highway. I came back after the hearing, and there was a thriving mall of a unique sort with dozens and dozens of stores and cars and people coming from all over Central Europe because it became a big bargain center. It was like those places you see along the highway with the outlet stores. I just couldn't believe it. I just stood there and I wandered all over the place. I wanted to look at everything saying, oh my God, we did do something.
There's a lot of talk right now about how, look how divided the United States is politically. I mean, we're talking about the Balkans in the 90s. You saw extreme political division there.
Horrible.
What sort of lessons do you think that holds for us, and how does that inform the way you work with people in the political arena?
Okay, well, I'll stretch the question a little bit.
Right.
The question there always was in Bosnia was, can Serbs, Croats, and Muslims, Bosniaks, live together, yes or no? And if they can't, what's the alternative, which is death, destruction, racial hatred? That's sort of the same question in Ukraine, especially eastern Ukraine. Russia takes the position that if there are Russian people there, they must be under the Russian government. We're getting a little of that here, that this country has to be controlled by those who belong here or who are presumably white. I grew up in an immigrant family. My grandfather's house, I grew up in his house. My family acquired it later. My parents were simple people. My father finished 6th grade. He and my mother were in trade unions at a factory and met each other there. So I'm used to simple people, and I was in an ethnic neighborhood as a kid. I thought it was great. That's the question. Do we like the differences? Are you offended that there's Spanish everywhere now in this country? Or are you pleased? I'm pleased. I like languages. I like foreign things. But I think the variety of people is a great phenomenon. But there are those in this country who don't want that. We don't have an immigration law nationally, as far as I'm concerned. We just exclude people, and the law doesn't work. It fell apart. But we're not replacing it. We're spending no time replacing the out-of-date immigration laws that we had. at the State House, we're passing bills about immigration. It's none of our business. It's not our responsibility to decide who owns land in America or who has a right to be here or who should be picked up off the street. I wasn't elected for that. That's not my job. But all that is driven by this fear that some people have, and they want to blame foreigners for every bad thing that happened. We got to get over that. We got to go back to being Americans, which means we're open to other people, and we profit from them. There are labor shortages in some of our industries now, at the low end, obviously, the roofers and crop workers, because we're excluding people that we could use. I heard a great comment. I'm very sympathetic to immigrants in an Irish song I was listening to the other day, and it talked about being a person, a parent or a grandparent, whose children speak a language that you do not know. And that's the way it is here. Many immigrants come. The grandparents never do really get to learn the English, but the kids do, and the grandkids really do. And they rise in our society. That's what I want, people who are going to rise and who are motivated, who made a huge decision to come here. I praise those people. I inherited it because my grandfather came, okay? So I have very strong feelings about these things. And I think we're off topic. We're just off topic. My job is to build roads, build schools, teach kids, support our universities, and all we do is attack our universities, attack our schools. It's a very, very difficult moment, which is why I'm hanging on for the moment. I'm not going to let this pass while I'm breathing without reacting to it.
Yeah, because essentially you saw the theoretical end of that in the Balkans.
Horrible. I haven't mentioned this, but I spent 7 months in Kosovo, which in some ways made Bosnia look like paradise. That was a 90% Albanian population with a 10% Serbian control group, and the levels of hatred were perhaps more frightening than in Bosnia. So yeah, I've seen enough of that. I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union in its waning years, did some business there, did some election work there, and as an example, people don't talk about it much, but I could tell how Jewish people were treated as opposed to other people. And they were allowed to contribute, but they were not allowed to be in charge. It was that simple. And they were making a lot of contributions, a lot of scientists, a lot of politicians, but mainly scientists and engineers who were really contributing to that country, but they could only rise so far.
You mentioned your family during that conversation just now. You and I were talking a little bit off mic. You said there was something from your upbringing you wanted to bring into the conversation as well.
Well, it was that, I wasn't in an immigrant family of a different sort. The Irish are blessed by having been forced to learn English, and so they had a somewhat easier time. But, yeah, I got used to that issue of there being another world, a world beyond the United States. And I wasn't offended that my grandfather was from Ireland. I was happy. Okay, and all his brothers, he had a herd of brothers. They were at the house. Everybody spoke with these accents. And I think that got me interested in language and also got me interested in immigration. And so I started studying languages in high school, and then in the military, of course, I spent full time on Russian. So, yeah, my family definitely affected me. My neighborhood, it was normal to have Italians across the street. I was in what I call a changing neighborhood. The day I was born, almost everybody in my neighborhood was Irish. By the time I was 10, almost everybody was Italian. We stayed, my family. People who treated us, they came to us with political problems. They came to us with language problems because we'd been around. We'd been here 2 generations, okay? So it was great. And that's my image of America. That's the one I want to see again.
You alluded to this. You served as an election monitor in Russia also. Tell me how that came about.
Well, we have a very quirky and I think intelligent system here that the congressional parties have a role in foreign policy, and one of their roles is to monitor elections and things. And different countries are assigned to different parties. So Russia, the Soviet Union at the time in the late 80s and 90s, was assigned to the Republicans. It's a group called the International Republican Institute, which is congressionally mandated. They monitor the elections in Russia. The Democrats monitor them in, say, Turkey. So there's a deal. there's a requirement that 5 of the 25 people who go to monitor a national election have to be from the other party. So there were 5 slots. President Clinton or his staff picked me to be one of the 5 Democrats to go along with the 20 Republicans to monitor the first 2 big sets of elections in Russia. I think it was 91 and 96, if I recall. John McCain was the leader of the delegation. I got to spend an amazing amount of time with him, had breakfast with him and his wife, alone in some hotel in Moscow, spent hours with him several times. I became a great admirer of his. I probably already was. So we went off to Moscow, and I was sent to, because I spoke the language, it was much easier to send me off. So I monitored the elections in prisons. I monitored the elections in a heavily Muslim town in Moscow, and had a lot of hope for Russia in the immediate post-Soviet era. I lost that hope. I was trying to do business there. The amount of corruption and influence was overwhelming. I said, I'm out of here. But I did enjoy monitoring their elections, and those 2 were largely fair, although there were signs of intimidation here and there. But I think they were pretty fair. But that's the last time that happened.
Yeah, which does lead me into my next question. Based on what you saw as an election monitor, how was Putin able to hijack the system over there?
The remnants of the inner part of the Communist Party did not go away. They gave up communism in a moment. What they wanted was benefits, perquisites, power, which had always been there. It would take me forever to explain how corrupt the Soviet Communist Party was and how there were people who had contacts and power and those who did not. So those who had power, what they did was they transitioned the industry basically on a corrupt basis. These are all government-owned factories and buildings and stuff. They transferred them for a song to their buddies, who then gave money to Putin. So it was driven by money and power. And there is a violent streak in the Russian leadership. They know how to use threats. I would say Putin was particularly adept at this. He was, and as far as I'm concerned, still is a KGB agent. And so they just powered their way, used money and used threats, and now they've got control.
Yeah, I think Putin himself said there was no such thing as a former KGB man.
Yeah, that's the truth. His personality, his demeanor, his behavior is just what you'd expect. Indifferent to other people's feelings, oriented towards power, much more, there's a fancy word, venal, much more corrupt. The corruption under the Soviet system was kind of low level. You got a nice trip for vacation, or you got an extra pound of coffee, or you got a car with a driver. That was about it. But once the Soviet system fell, you could get a factory, not a cup of coffee. You could get yourself a factory if you knew how to get that done. So, yeah, it's, I think, a very difficult situation. And I think a big part of it is the ethnic group issue, which is 25% of the people in Russia are Muslim, but they're not allowed, again, to rise to the top. And there's this feeling that the Russian language and culture are very important and must be extended to protect people in any country who are from that group. And so there's threats to the Baltic states. There's historic interest in Polish territory. Ukraine is the worst example, of course. The Russians refuse to give up the eastern part of Ukraine, even though it's part of Ukraine, because it's got Russian speakers. Okay. And so we have all this death and destruction.
What do you think, what sort of lessons do you believe the fall of democracy in Russia holds for us here in the United States?
We're in a different category because we do, in principle, I want to say intuitively accept diversity. Our courts have given up on it, and Trump has certainly given up on it. But I think intuitively our people don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about whether somebody's Italian or Polish or Irish anymore. Those things have gone away. The pressure is on the new groups, largely the Hispanics, and the eternal pressure on African Americans. But I think there's enough ethnic understanding in this country that we'll get through this, and we'll start opening up normal immigration again, not extremely high and not restricted and low as we now have, because it's partly our businesses understand we need to be part of the world, and we need people from around the world, both low-level people who are putting on roofs and high-level people who are coming up with artificial intelligence. So I think we'll be all right on that front. I just think it's going to take us a while, and we're going to have to look in the mirror and say, what is it we really want here? Do we want to express our anger or our hope? And I think, thank God for young people. They're not into this, for the most part, into this ethnic hatred. They don't understand it. They've learned to understand other groups. So I think we'll get through it, but it's going to be very hard picking up some of the damage that's been done.
Yeah, so you don't necessarily see the rise of Putin as a cautionary tale per se for the United States.
It's too different. But there are elements. This word, I love this, is transactionalism. Everything's a deal. Everything's in effect, a bribe often, or a punishment. We take troops out of Germany not because we should, but because we're mad at them this week. That's, to my mind, is silly. So we'll have remnants of that, and there'll be consequences to that. There'll be some good things. I think the Europeans are going to do a better job of taking care of themselves, and I think they're going to be better competitors. They're not going to be our allies so much. They're going to be our competitors, and that may be a healthy thing for all concerned. So yeah, I don't want to say that the Russian experience or the fascist experience is totally applicable. They're just hints. The use of hatred, the use of fear of the others, fear of the foreigner, those are common, but they're not powerful enough forces, I don't think, in this country. But we got a long road to go. A long road. The Supreme Court decision the other day about whether you can consider race in voting may lead to a surge, or it is leading to a surge of redistricting. So we're going to fight that fight.
So we'll leave that there for today. Representative, thank you for coming in. And then when we come back, we'll talk about your career in the State House.
Well, that won't be glorious, but it'll be interesting. I'll give it some thought. Thanks, Gary.
All right. Thank you.
From Wish TV, this is All Indiana Politics Podcast on the All Indiana Podcast Network. Watch All Indiana Politics live Sunday mornings at 9:30 on Wish TV and at wishtv.com. Subscribe to this podcast and listen weekly here on the All Indiana Podcast Network. And be sure to discover even more great podcasts at allindianapodcastnetwork.com.